I never thought I'd end up here, working as a janitor in a place that feels more like a forgotten shrine to something terrible than a sanctuary. The job came out of nowhere. An anonymous listing, no interviews, just a phone call late one evening. They told me the basics: night shifts, minimal contact, strict rules. Nothing about the place itself. I arrived on a cold, foggy evening, the kind that presses silence into your ears. The sanctuary stood on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow any sound. The building looked ancient, peeling paint, shuttered windows, and heavy iron gates that groaned like they resented opening. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp stone and something older, almost metallic. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I made my rounds, the halls dimly lit by flickering overhead bulbs. It was quiet, too quiet, like the building itself was holding its breath. Something about the place unsettled me from the start, but I told myself it was just nerves, the result of starting a new job alone in an unfamiliar, creepy building. The first night was uneventful, almost boring, except for the strange sensation that I was being watched, though I never saw anyone. The shadows cast by the peeling wallpaper twisted in the dim light, making familiar shapes feel foreign and hostile. I kept reminding myself to focus on the tasks, sweeping, mopping, emptying trash, but every creak and whisper of wind unsettled my thoughts. At one point, I found a small, faded note taped to a door near the back hallway. It simply said, "Remember the rules." No signature, no explanation. My curiosity prickled, but I shoved it aside, figuring it was some old staff joke. Still, a cold shiver ran down my spine. That was just the beginning. As the hours dragged on, the stillness in the sanctuary began to feel heavier, almost suffocating. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, like the walls were holding secrets they refused to share. Somewhere deep inside, a soft, rhythmic thumping echoed faintly, but whenever I paused to listen, it would stop. I told myself it was just the old plumbing, or maybe the wind playing tricks, but that nagging feeling in my gut refused to fade. I wandered the corridors, flashlight in hand, passing rooms that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Old chairs were draped with dusty sheets, peeling photographs hung crookedly on the walls, faces blurred and eyes hollow. The air was thick with a mustiness that settled into my lungs and made each breath heavier. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A low murmur, like whispers carried just beyond hearing. I froze, heart hammering. The sanctuary felt alive in that moment, like it was breathing around me. I followed the sound to a small chapel at the building's heart. The door was cracked open, and inside, the candlelight flickered despite no windows or power sockets. The whispers stopped as I stepped closer, replaced by a chilling silence that pressed against my skin. I wanted to leave, but something tethered me there, a curiosity I couldn't shake even as dread curled in my stomach. Before I turned away, I caught sight of scrawled words on the altar's wooden edge. "The rules will keep you safe." The phrase echoed the note I'd found earlier. For the first time, I wondered what rules those might be, and what could happen if they were broken. Back in the quiet of the hallway, I leaned against the cold wall, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The sanctuary had shifted somehow, from a creepy, abandoned building to a place charged with an unseen presence. I felt the weight of eyes on me, but when I looked around, nothing moved. Just shadows folding into corners, waiting. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, the stress of a new job, the isolation of the night shift, but deep down, I knew this place wasn't ordinary. That faded note, the whispering chapel, the flickering candle without a source, they weren't coincidences. Something was watching, waiting, and it seemed to be keeping score. I had no idea what I'd gotten myself into, but one thing was clear already. If there were rules here, I needed to find them and follow them, because whatever lurked in this sanctuary wasn't interested in company. It wanted obedience. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on a rickety wooden bench in the break room, staring at the faded walls, feeling the sanctuary's breath on my neck. The shadows stretched long and cold, and somewhere far off, the bells tolled, deep, sonorous, and full of warning. The next morning felt like a different world compared to the oppressive silence of the night. Daylight streaming through grimy windows should have brought relief, but instead it revealed just how decayed and forgotten the sanctuary really was. Paint peeled in thick flakes from the walls, and dust lay thick on every surface, untouched by time or care. Still, beneath all that neglect, something darker seemed to pulse quietly beneath the surface, as if the building itself was a living, breathing thing, ancient and watchful. That morning, as I made my rounds emptying trash and scrubbing floors, I was approached by an older man who introduced himself simply as the caretaker. His face was weathered and his eyes sharp, though the war was a strange intensity to them, as if he carried the weight of secrets nobody else knew. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Instead, he handed me a worn, leather-bound notebook with frayed edges and yellowed pages. "These are the rules," he said, voice low and gravelly. 5 rules. Break any one of them, and you won't last here long. He didn't explain what would happen, only that the rules were unbreakable and necessary. I flipped through the notebook, the faded ink almost trembling beneath my fingertips. The rules were simple in wording, but cryptic in meaning. Never be alone. Do not speak to it. Don't look back. Never enter the basement. Leave when the bells toll. I felt a chill settle over me. The rules were more like warnings, etched from hard experience. The caretaker's eyes bore into mine as he said, "You'll learn why soon enough. Just remember, these keep you alive." I wanted to ask what it was, what exactly was down in the basement, why the bells rang, but he shook his head and disappeared down the corridor, leaving me with the weight of those words hanging in the stale air. As I stood there holding the notebook, the sanctuary suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls were closing in. The silence seemed heavier now, charged with the implication that someone was watching, waiting for a misstep. I tucked the notebook into my jacket pocket, realizing that this place was far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. That day, every shadow seemed deeper, every creak sharper, and the air colder despite the weak sunlight filtering through the grime. The rules weren't just advice, they were a lifeline, and I was already scared. The day dragged on with a strange tension I couldn't shake. Every time I glanced at the notebook in my pocket, the weight of those 5 simple lines seemed to press heavier against my thoughts. The caretaker's warning echoed in my mind. Break any of them, and you won't last here long. But what exactly was it? Why was the basement forbidden? And who decided when the bells would toll? As evening crept closer, the sanctuary's shadows deepened once again. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long, dancing shapes along the cracked walls. I found myself watching those shadows too closely, catching shapes out of the corner of my eye, fleeting movements that disappeared when I turned toward them. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Trying to steady my nerves, I focused on my work, pushing a mop back and forth across the cold floor. The rhythmic sound was oddly soothing, grounding me in the present. But beneath that rhythm, there was an unsettling undertone, a faint whispering, almost like distant voices carried by the wind through cracked windows. I stopped, heart pounding, but silence answered my ears. Maybe it was the wind, maybe my imagination was playing tricks. Yet the sanctuary seemed alive with secrets. Later, I noticed something odd near the chapel. The door was no longer closed as it had been the night before, but slightly ajar. Against better judgment, I stepped inside, the scent of old wax and stone thick in the air. The candle on the altar flickered in the absence of any breeze. My eyes traced the faded carvings and symbols etched into the wood, cryptic and unsettling. At the base of the altar, the phrase, "The rules will keep you safe," was etched deeply, almost as if carved by a desperate hand. The phrase clawed at me, resonating with the notebook's warning. I realized that these rules weren't arbitrary. They were the sanctuary's fragile defense against something far darker lurking just beyond the edge of understanding. I wanted to believe they were just superstitions or remnants of old staff warnings, but the sanctuary itself seemed to pulse with an energy that suggested otherwise. I looked down at the notebook again. My fingers traced the words, and I silently promised myself to obey them. There was a cold certainty in the caretaker's tone, in the way the shadows whispered, that I wouldn't get a second chance. The rest of that night I sat alone in the break room, the notebook lying open on the worn table before me like a grim scripture. The silence around me felt heavier than ever, as if the very air was waiting, watching to see what I'd do next. I ran my fingers over the faded ink again and again, the 5 rules looping through my mind like a haunting refrain. I couldn't stop thinking about the caretaker's words. Break any one of them, and you won't last. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just an elaborate scare tactic meant to keep me in line. But the sanctuary wasn't normal. It wasn't just an old building with peeling paint and flickering lights. It had a pulse, a secret, and a hunger I couldn't yet understand. My thoughts kept returning to the first rule, never be alone. That simple phrase twisted inside me, because here I was, alone every night. Was I already breaking the rules without knowing it? What horrors waited in the silence when no one else was around? The idea tightened around my chest like a vice. I thought about the second rule: do not speak to it. Who or what was it? The sanctuary gave me no answers. I imagined something lurking in the shadows, waiting for a word, a moment of weakness, to reach out. The thought made my throat dry and my hands clammy. The third rule, don't look back, gnawed at me the most. Was it paranoia or what's here? As there really something that followed from behind, something too terrible to face. I found myself glancing over my shoulder in hallways, catching flickers of movement that disappeared when I turned. Then there was the basement, never enter. That one was like a siren song. Forbidden places always draw the curious, and the idea of descending into darkness, to a place where even the caretaker feared to go, was almost unbearable. I wondered if that's where the true nightmare hid. Finally, the bells. The idea that some unseen force would summon you away when they tolled sent chills racing down my spine. What happened if you didn't leave? What fate awaited the foolish or the defiant? I tried to calm myself, telling myself that these were just rules, guidelines, maybe even old superstitions, but the sanctuary's atmosphere was too oppressive, the shadows too alive. I felt like a mouse in a predator's lair, vulnerable and exposed. As the hours crept past, I realized the sanctuary was not just a place to clean and maintain, it was a place to survive, and survival meant obeying rules I barely understood. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the darkness, listening to the distant hollow toll of the bells, wondering what nightmare would greet me tomorrow. The nights after learning the rules were the hardest. That first rule, never be alone, hung over me like a dark cloud. It was almost laughable at first. I was the janitor. Who else would be here during the graveyard shift? The place was deserted, except for me. I tried to tell myself it was just a figure of speech, a metaphor, but deep down I knew it wasn't. One particular night, the wind was howling outside, rattling the sanctuary's ancient windows like angry ghosts pounding on the glass. I had just finished mopping the main hallway when the lights flickered and a sudden chill swept through the building. The temperature dropped fast, so fast I could see my breath misting in the air. My skin prickled. I told myself to shake it off. Old buildings do that, right? But the silence that followed was different. It was unnatural, stretched thin like a taut wire about to snap. Every step I took seemed louder than it should be, echoing off the cold stone walls like a countdown. Then I heard it, a faint shuffle behind me, soft but deliberate, like someone or something was trying not to be noticed. My heart lurched, but I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself it was just the building settling. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable now, thick as the fog outside. I reached the corner near the chapel where I'd found the note about the rules. I stopped, listening hard, but only the steady drip of water from a leaky pipe answered me. That's when I caught it, a shadow moving at the edge of my vision, quick and fleeting. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the same peeling walls and the empty hallway stretching out into darkness. I tried to rationalize it, exhaustion, the loneliness, the fact that my mind was playing tricks. But as I moved on, the unease clung to me, growing heavier with every step. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, quicker now, heart pounding so loud I was sure it must echo through the halls. I reminded myself of the rule, never be alone. But I was alone, completely alone, or was I? The line between reality and something else was beginning to blur. Shadows lengthened and twisted, the sanctuary breathing and alive in ways I couldn't explain. The sense of being watched became almost suffocating, pressing in on me from every direction. That night, I learned that the rule wasn't just a warning, it was a commandment carved from survival, because being alone in the sanctuary wasn't safe, not at all. The shuffle behind me wasn't a one-time thing. As the night deepened, so did the presence. It was subtle at first, soft footsteps echoing just out of sight, the faintest whisper brushing past my ears like a cold breath. Every time I stopped, the sounds stopped too. Every time I moved, they followed, as if the shadows themselves were stalking my steps. I tried to stay calm, telling myself to ignore it, to focus on my work. But the sanctuary has a way of twisting your mind, making ordinary sounds feel like warnings, turning the silence into a suffocating pressure. At one point, I found myself near the basement door. The one rule forbade me to enter. It stood solid and unyielding, painted with faded warning signs. But tonight, there was a strange pull, an almost magnetic tug that made my fingers itch to turn the knob, to open it just a crack and peer inside. I resisted, reminding myself of the rule, never be alone. The words echoed sharp and clear, because if you're alone, you're vulnerable. Something in the sanctuary feeds on that vulnerability. As I turned away, the temperature dropped even more. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see faint mist curling around my feet. The hallway lights flickered violently, plunging me into near darkness for a moment. When they snapped back on, I was sure I caught a glimpse of a figure standing at the far end of the corridor, just a shadow, blurred and indistinct, but unmistakably there. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I swallowed the lump in my throat and blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. Only the silence remained, but it was heavy, charged with something unseen and dangerous. That night, the sanctuary felt alive in a way I'd never experienced. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows shifted with intention, and I was no longer sure which noises were real and which were born false. My fear. I kept whispering the rules to myself like a mantra as I moved through the halls. Never be alone, because in this place, loneliness wasn't just scary, it was deadly. When my shift finally ended, I felt like I'd been running a marathon through a nightmare. My hands trembled as I locked the doors behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, waiting just beyond the walls, hungry for the moment I'd slip up. The moment my shift ended, the weight of the night pressed down on me like a suffocating shroud. The sanctuary's eerie silence had transformed into something unbearable, a living presence lingering just out of sight, in the corners of my vision, behind every shadow. My hands shook as I secured the heavy iron doors, each click echoing louder than it should in the empty building. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, the product of long hours and the unnatural isolation, but deep inside, a cold knot of fear had settled, tightening with every breath. The rule, never be alone, was no longer just words on a faded page. It was a raw, desperate command carved into my survival. On the way home, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, convinced I saw flickers of movement just beyond the trees lining the road, shadows that shouldn't be there, faces that vanished when I looked directly. My mind raced, grappling with the fine line between paranoia and reality. Sleep was impossible. Every creak and whisper in the dark felt amplified, a sinister echo of the night's events. I found myself staring at the clock, waiting for the hours to pass, willing the morning light to come faster. But even then, the sanctuary's presence clung to me like a second skin. The phrase the caretaker had said, the one about the rules keeping me alive, played on repeat in my head. I felt like a mouse trapped in a maze, desperate to evos. I'd traps I couldn't see. I kept replaying the moments when I saw the shadow, when the temperature dropped, when the lights flickered as if warning me. The sanctuary wasn't just a building, it was a predator, and I was its prey. That night, I questioned everything. Was I losing my mind? Was the fear creating hallucinations? Or was there truly something living in those walls, something ancient and unforgiving? Whatever it was, it thrived on solitude. I realized then that the first rule was more than just a guideline, it was a lifeline. Being alone wasn't just dangerous, it was a direct invitation to the darkness waiting to consume me. I made a promise to myself that night. No matter how scared I was, no matter how tempting it might be to face the silence head-on, I would never be alone in that sanctuary again. Because in this place, loneliness wasn't just a feeling, it was a death sentence. The days blurred together, each night heavier than the last. But it was on the fifth night, as a thick fog swallowed the sanctuary, that the weight of the second rule, do not speak to it, descended upon me with terrifying clarity. I was finishing my rounds in the East Wing, a part of the building that smelled of mildew and forgotten prayers. The walls here were lined with old portraits, faces worn by time, their eyes seeming to follow me wherever I went. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows that danced and twisted, distorting familiar shapes into sinister forms. The air was thick and cold, carrying whispers that I couldn't quite catch. At first, I thought it was the wind sneaking through cracks, but the voices felt deliberate, laced with a strange urgency that made my skin crawl. I slowed my steps, clutching the notebook tightly in my pocket as if it were a talisman. Then, from somewhere just beyond my vision, I heard a soft, raspy voice. It was low and breathless, like someone speaking from the edge of a nightmare. The words were indecipherable at first, nothing more than a sibilant hiss curling around the walls. But thus, and the voice grew clearer, more insistent, whispering my name. I froze, heart pounding, eyes darting to every dark corner. The sanctuary seemed to hold its breath, the usual creaks and groans replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. My mouth went dry. I remembered the rule, do not speak to it. But the voice beckoned, a siren pulling me deeper into the shadows. For a moment I wanted to answer, to speak back and ask what it wanted. but terror rooted me in place. Something told me that breaking this rule wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. The voice wasn't human. It was ancient, hungry, and patient. I forced myself to walk away, each step heavier than the last. The whispers faded, but the chill remained, creeping into my bones. My mind raced with questions I dared not voice aloud. Who or what was it? Why did it speak only to me? And what would happen if I broke the silence? That night, the sanctuary felt more alive than ever. The shadows no longer just hiding places, but active players in a deadly game. The rules were no longer suggestions. They were the only things standing between me and the darkness that wanted to consume me. I knew I had to obey, but deep down, I feared that sooner or later it would demand I speak. And when that happened, there might be no turning back. That night, the sanctuary's atmosphere thickened into something almost tangible, a tension that wrapped itself around me like a suffocating fog. The air felt charged, alive with an energy that wasn't human. I could feel it crawling along my skin, whispering just beyond hearing, teasing me with faint, fragmented words that sent chills down my spine. As I moved through the east wing, the whispering began again, soft and insistent, calling my name in a voice that sounded both familiar and utterly alien. My breath hitched and I froze, gripping the notebook in my hand as if it could shield me from whatever lurked in the shadows. The rule echoed in my mind, clear and uncompromising. Do not speak to it. But the voice didn't want silence. It wanted a response. I wanted to run, to escape into the safety of the lit corridors, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, pressing in from all sides, wrapping around me like invisible hands. The temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in quick, frosty bursts. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I fought the overwhelming urge to speak, to break the silence that tethered me to the nightmare. A figure materialized from the darkness at the edge of my vision, a shadowy shape with no clear form, just shifting darkness that seemed to pulse and breathe. It was it, the thing I was warned about, the presence the caretaker had never named aloud. I swallowed hard, sweat slicking my palms. The voice changed then, softening, becoming almost coaxing. It promised safety, release, answers. Temptation clawed at me, pulling at the frayed edges of my resolve. But I knew better. To speak was to invite something far worse. I took a shaky step backward, mumbling the rules under my breath like a prayer. The shadows seemed to recoil, the figure dissolving into the darkness like smoke. The whispers faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed into my chest. For hours afterward, I sat alone in the break room, my skin crawling with the memory of the encounter. The sanctuary's shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. I realized then that it was not just a voice or a presence, but a test, a predator waiting for me to falter. That night shattered the fragile boundary I'd clung to. I understood now that breaking the rule wouldn't just endanger me, it could unravel everything. The sanctuary's dark heart was watching, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment I spoke. After that night, the weight of the second rule pressed on me heavier than ever. Do not speak to it. Simple words on paper, but now they carried a terrifying gravity I couldn't escape. Every shadow in the sanctuary seemed alive, every whisper a potential threat. The memory of that voice, the way it called my name, soft yet urgent, lingered in my mind like a dark echo. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, afraid that the darkness would coalesce again into that shifting, formless presence. Sleep became a distant memory. Each time I closed my eyes, I heard the faintest hiss, felt the brush of invisible fingers on my skin. I tried to convince myself it was just fear, but the sanctuary had a way of making the unreal feel inevitable. The notebook's rules had become my lifeline, a fragile thread holding me to sanity. I repeated them to myself like a mantra, desperate to keep the darkness at bay. The fear of speaking, even accidentally, to it made my voice catch in my throat, made silence feel like both a shield and a prison. What haunted me most wasn't the presence itself, but the knowledge that it was waiting, patient, cunning, and relentless. It didn't need to shout or threaten. Its whispers were enough to twist my thoughts, to wear down my will. The sanctuary seemed to breathe around me, a living nightmare. That fed on my growing paranoia. I realized I was changing. The man who had arrived curious and skeptical was slipping away, replaced by someone haunted and watchful. The isolation was crushing, and the rules felt less like protection and more like chains, but breaking them was unthinkable. The sanctuary's hunger was real, and I was its prey. One night, staring into the darkened hallways, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. This place wasn't going to let me go easily. The rules weren't just survival tactics, they were warnings etched in blood and fear. The sanctuary was a cage, and it was the keeper. I don't know how long I can hold on, but for now, I'll stay silent. because speaking is a risk I'm not willing to take, not yet. The days grew heavier with dread, each night feeling like walking further into a shadow I couldn't escape. After surviving the whispered temptations of it, I thought the worst was behind me. But the sanctuary had more rules, more traps to test my resolve. The third rule, don't look back, weighed on me like a silent threat. It was an ordinary night, or at least it should have been. The fog pressed thick outside, swirling around the sanctuary like a living thing. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the flickering lights casting long, wavering shadows down endless hallways. I was making my rounds, the soft scrape of my boots against the cracked tiles the only sound. The building seemed quiet, but the silence carried an edge, an unspoken warning. As I moved deeper into the west wing, the sensation of being followed prickled at the back of my neck. It was a feeling I'd grown used to, the subtle shift in the air, the brush of cold that made my skin crawl. I tried to steady my breath, reminding myself of the rules, the lifelines that kept me tethered to survival. Then I heard it, a faint, uneven footstep behind me, slow and deliberate. My heart stuttered in my chest. I told myself to keep moving forward, not to look back. The third rule echoed loudly in my mind, but the instinct to turn was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed to glance over my shoulder, to see what, or who, was there. I resisted, forcing my eyes straight ahead, but my body trembled with the urge. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, matching my pace with an eerie rhythm. I gripped my mop handle tighter, feeling the cold sweat prickling at my temples. The sanctuary's walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching toward me like dark fingers. The cold intensified, fog rolling in through cracked windows, swirling at my feet like creeping smoke. With every step, the tension built, an invisible tether pulling at me to look back, to break the rule. I told myself it was just my imagination, the sanctuary's twisted way of playing games, but the presence was real. I could feel it, heavy and patient, waiting for me to falter. That night, I learned that don't look back wasn't just a caution, it was a lifeline. The footsteps behind me weren't just echoes anymore. They had a rhythm, a life of their own. Each step was deliberate, slow, and measured, matching mine perfectly. It was as if whatever was there was toying with me, testing my will to obey the rule. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped animal desperate to escape. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, its flickering lights casting unstable shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe. I forced myself not to look back, focusing instead on the cracked tiles beneath my boots. But the pull was magnetic, like an invisible thread tugging at my very being, begging me to glance over my shoulder. I felt my breath hitch, muscles tense, every nerve screaming that if I looked back, I would lose everything. Then a cold whisper grazed my ear, a breath of wind or something else I couldn't tell. It was low and raspy, a sound that felt less like a word and more like a warning. The temperature dropped sharply, frost creeping along the edges of my vision. The mop in my hand suddenly felt heavier, as if weighted by unseen hands. My resolve cracked. Just as my fingers twitched toward the urge to glance behind me, a sudden noise shattered the silence, a sharp clatter from the far end of the corridor. My body jolted, and I almost lost my balance. But I didn't look back. I forced myself to keep moving forward, each step harder than the last. The footsteps behind me stopped. An oppressive silence swallowed the hallway, thick and suffocating. I wanted to believe the presence had retreated, that I'd passed the test. But deep down, I knew better. For the rest of the night, the sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. The shadows clung to the walls like living things, and every creak, every whisper felt amplified. My mind replayed that cold breath on my neck, the weight in my hand, the invisible thread pulling me backward. I realized then that don't look back wasn't just about avoiding fear, it was about survival. Looking back meant acknowledging the darkness behind you, giving it power to reach out and claim you. By the time dawn crept through the grimy windows, I was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. The rule wasn't just a command, it was a boundary between life and something far worse. And I knew that if I ever broke it, I might never escape the sanctuary's shadows. After that night, the weight of the third rule settled into my bones like a cold stone I couldn't shake. Don't look back was no longer just advice. It had become a constant battle within me, a fight against every instinct screaming to glance over my shoulder. The sanctuary's shadows seemed to deepen with every passing hour, as if the darkness itself was feeding on my fear and hesitation. I found myself walking the halls with my head fixed forward, eyes glued to the cracked tiles, afraid that even a flicker of doubt would give the shadows the invitation they craved. The sensation of being followed never left me. It hovered at the edge of my senses, a persistent, breathless presence that waited for me to falter. Sleep became a stranger. Each time I closed my eyes, the memory of that cold breath brushing past my ear haunted me. The whispers, the unseen footsteps played on a loop in my mind, relentless and unforgiving. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced that if I turned over, I'd see those shadowy figures looming at the foot of my bed. The rule had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't just about survival in the sanctuary's physical spaces. It was about surviving the sanctuary's psychological grip. Looking back meant acknowledging the darkness. It meant giving it permission to touch me, to claim me. I started to realize that the sanctuary wasn't just a place. It was a test, a relentless challenge to my will and sanity. The rules were the only shields I had against whatever malevolent force lurked beneath the peeling paint and crumbling walls. Every time I obeyed, I felt a fragile sense of safety. Every time I even thought about breaking them, dread flooded my veins like poison. One evening, as I stood near the chapel, I caught myself hesitating. A flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching a little too long, made me freeze. The urge to look back clawed at me with fierce insistence, but I forced my gaze forward, repeating the rules silently like a prayer. In that moment, I understood the sanctuary's cruel lesson. Sometimes survival isn't about courage or strength. It's about restraint. It's about walking forward blindly, even when everything inside screams to turn around. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to that. The sanctuary's grip tightens every day and the shadows grow bolder. But I cling to the rules like lifelines, knowing that if I break them, the darkness won't just catch me, it will consume me. The sanctuary's basement was a place shrouded in silence and shadow, whispered about but never seen by anyone who wanted to live. From the moment I started, I'd heard warnings, not just from the caretaker's notebook, but from the uneasy glances of those who came before me, and from the atmosphere itself. Never enter the basement wasn't just a rule, it was a commandment carved from fear and experience. That night, the fog lay thick around the sanctuary like a suffocating blanket, and the wind howled mournfully through the cracked windows. I was finishing my shift, moving slowly through the lower levels, the worn wooden floors creaking beneath my boots. The air was damp and heavy, smelling of mold and forgotten memories. The walls seemed to close in, shadows pooling like spilled ink around the corners. I found myself near the door to the basement, a heavy rusted metal door with peeling paint, and a lock that looked brittle but unyielding. I'd never dared to go near it before, but tonight something pulled at me, a dark curiosity mingled with dread. My fingers itched to reach out and touch the cold metal, to feel what secrets lay beyond. The notebook's warning rang in my mind, never enter the basement, but the word never felt like a challenge, like an invitation to step into the unknown. As I stood there, a sudden chill swept through the hallway, freezing the air in place. The lights flickered violently, then died, plunging me into a darkness so thick it felt like a living thing. My breath caught in my throat as my flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely cutting through the black. The silence was shattered by a low, distant sound, a groan, a scrape, something ancient and desperate. It seemed to come from beneath the floor, vibrating through the very boards beneath my feet. My heart hammered painfully against my ribs. I wanted to run, to turn away and forget whatever, or pulled me here. But the basement door loomed before me, a dark portal to secrets the sanctuary wanted to keep hidden. I took a step back, then another, until finally I was out of reach, the notebook clutched tightly in my hand. The sanctuary's basement was a place where even the shadows feared to tread, and for good reason. The basement door stood before me like a silent sentinel, its rusted metal surface cold and unforgiving under my trembling fingertips. That night, the sanctuary's air was thick with something unnatural, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. The oppressive silence felt alive, waiting, watching. I'd promised myself I wouldn't go near the basement, never enter it, but the pull was stronger than fear. An unexplainable curiosity, a dark whisper inside my mind urging me to push the boundaries. I could almost hear the faintest scrape of movement beneath the floorboards, a sound like claws dragging slowly across concrete. My flashlight flickered, sputtered, and then dimmed almost to nothing. Panic surged in my chest. The cold air wrapped around me, heavier than before, as if the basement itself exhaled a breath full of ancient dread. I took a hesitant step closer, my heart hammering like a drum in my ears. Suddenly, the lock on the basement door rattled, a dry, grating noise that sent a jolt through my body. I stumbled back, breath shallow and rapid. The noise stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving a heavy silence that weighed down the hallway. Then, from the darkness beyond the door, a whisper rose, a breathy, agonized sound that twisted around my name, curling like smoke into my ears. The voice wasn't human. It was broken, fractured, as if it belonged to something that had existed for centuries, trapped between worlds. I wanted to scream, to bolt down the corridor and out of the sanctuary forever, but my legs were frozen in place. The rules, repeated in my mind, never enter the basement. Not just a suggestion, but a line drawn in the darkness, a boundary I dared not cross. The shadows around me deepened, and I saw just beyond the doorframe a flicker of movement, something dark, shifting, pulsing with a life of its own. The air grew colder still, and I felt a presence pressing against my back, as if the sanctuary itself was trying to push me toward that forbidden doorway. With every ounce of willpower, I tore myself away, stumbling backward into the faint glow of the hallway lights. My breath came out ragged, and sweat slicked my skin despite the cold. I clutched the notebook like a lifeline, its words burned into my mind. That night, I learned the basement wasn't just a place. It was a prison, a gateway, a secret the sanctuary guarded with its dark, hungry heart. And no rule was more important than this: never enter the basement. After that night, the sanctuary's basement became more than just a forbidden place. It was a dark scar etched deep into my mind. The memory of the cold metal door, the rattling lock, and that fractured whisper clawed at me relentlessly. The warning in the notebook, never enter the basement, now felt like the most urgent rule of all, because whatever lay beneath wasn't just danger, it was something far worse. The air inside the sanctuary seemed heavier after that encounter, thick with a silent threat. Every creak and groan of the building set my nerves on edge. I found myself avoiding the lower levels altogether, taking longer routes to steer clear of the basement door. But the shadows still whispered, and the chill I felt near that part of the building lingered long after I'd left. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice, the fractured, ancient sound that had twisted my name like a curse. It wasn't a voice meant for the living, but something trapped between worlds, desperate to be heard yet bound by unseen chains. The thought made my stomach turn, a cold dread settling over me like frost. Sleep was harder to come by than ever. The sanctuary's silence followed me home, haunting my dreams with fleeting shapes and distant whispers. I woke more than once, heart pounding, sure I heard scratching at my bedroom window or felt invisible fingers brush my skin. The basement door had become a symbol of everything I feared but couldn't fully understand. It was the line between the known and the unknown, the safe and the terrifying. I realized that the rules weren't just about keeping me alive in the sanctuary. They were about keeping me sane, about keeping the darkness locked away. But the sanctuary's hunger was relentless, and the basement was its heart. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on to the fragile barrier the rules provided. The basement called to me, a silent siren in the depths of my mind, tempting and terrifying all at once. I didn't want to break the rule. I didn't want to know what lay beneath those heavy doors. But the sanctuary had other plans, and sometimes I feared that my curiosity and my survival would be the same thing. The bells. From the moment I arrived at the sanctuary, their distant toll was a constant presence, haunting the edges of every night. The notebook's last rule was the most cryptic of all. The bells you hear are not from any church. At first I thought it was just a warning to not mistake the sanctuary's old bell tower for a regular call to prayer or ceremony. But as the night stretched on, I realized the bells carried a deeper, darker meaning, one that chilled me to my core. That evening the sky was overcast, the thick clouds blotting out the moon and stars, casting the sanctuary into unnatural gloom. The wind whispered through the cracked windows, carrying with it a strange, metallic scent that made my stomach twist. I was near the bell tower, finishing a late inspection, when the first toll cut through the silence, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. The sound wasn't like any bell I'd ever heard. It was hollow and distorted, reverberating through the sanctuary's bones. The air seemed to shudder with each strike, sending a shiver down my spine. The shadows around me deepened, flickering as if the very fabric of reality was trembling. The notebook's warning echoed in my mind. The bells you hear are not from any church. I scanned the tower, half expecting to find an explanation, some mechanical malfunction or natural cause. But the bell tower was empty, silent, save for the lingering echoes of that unnatural toll. Then the bells sounded again, 3 slow, mournful chimes that seemed to call out a warning. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to move toward the sanctuary's deeper corridors, as if the sound was summoning me to some unknown fate. The hairs on my arms stood on end. My pulse quickened. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. But as the night wore on, the bells tolled sporadically, each time followed by an eerie silence that pressed in on me like a weight. The sanctuary felt alive, responsive to the sound, as if the bells were a signal to something lurking in the shadows, something waiting for the moment the last note faded. I knew then that the fifth rule wasn't just a warning about sound. It was a summons, a call to attention, and ignoring it could be deadly. The bells tolled again, their sound slicing through the thick, oppressive air like a blade. This time, the chimes weren't just distant echoes. They resonated deep within my chest, vibrating with a frequency that unsettled every nerve ending. I stood frozen near the sanctuary's main hall, my ears ringing with the unnatural tolling that seemed to ripple through the very walls. It was impossible to pinpoint their source. The bell tower loomed overhead, silent and empty, its rusty mechanism still and lifeless. Yet the bells kept ringing, slow, mournful, and relentless, each note carrying a weight far heavier than any earthly sound. The air grew colder with every chime, a biting frost creeping along the edges of my skin. Shadows twisted and writhed in the corners of my vision, the sanctuary's usual silence replaced by an almost electric tension. The hair on my arms rose as if warning me of some unseen threat closing in. I wanted to run, to escape the haunting melody that gripped me like a vice. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, caught in the grip of an invisible force that pushed and pulled me deeper into the heart of the sanctuary. Then, out of the shadows, I caught a glimpse, a fleeting figure darting just beyond the flickering light. A face, a shadow, it was impossible to tell, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. The bells tolled again, a slow, deliberate sequence that felt like a countdown. My breath came in shallow gasps. The sanctuary's walls seemed to pulse in time with the chimes, alive and breathing. I realized that the bells weren't just sounds. They were warnings, signals, calls to something lurking beneath the surface. As the last note faded, the oppressive silence returned, thick and suffocating. The shadows lingered, watching, waiting. The air was charged with a sense of impending doom that pressed down on me like a physical weight. That night, I understood the true meaning behind the rule. The bells are not from any church. They were a summons from the darkness, a call to attention from whatever ancient force ruled this sinister place. Ignoring the bells wasn't an option. To do so was to invite the sanctuary's full wrath. After that night, the haunting toll of the bells stayed with me like a dark melody etched into my mind. The sanctuary's warning, "The bells are not from any church," had taken on a sinister new meaning. It wasn't just about the sound itself, but the power behind it. An ancient summons that stirred the shadows and awakened something restless. Sleep became elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the distant ringing, slow and mournful, cutting through the silence like a dirge. It echoed in my dreams, blending with whispers and cold drafts that brushed my skin. The line between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving me trapped in a waking horror. The sanctuary seemed to pulse with life when the bells tolled. The walls would vibrate subtly, and the shadows deepened, stretching like dark fingers reaching for me. The air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension that made my skin prickle. It was as if the bells were a heartbeat, the rhythm of some malevolent force lying beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to strike. I began to dread the sound, knowing that each toll was a countdown to something inevitable. The sanctuary wasn't just a building, it was a prison, and the bells were its cruel signal that whatever lurked in the dark was watching, growing stronger. I found myself avoiding the bell tower, steering clear of the places where the sounds seemed to resonate most. But the tolling could reach me anywhere. In the echo of footsteps, the creak of old wood, even the silence between breaths, it was relentless, inescapable. The rules had become a fragile shield, each one a lifeline in this place of shadows. But the bells were different. They weren't just a rule to follow. They were a warning, a summons, a threat. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to my sanity, living under the shadow of those bells. The sanctuary's darkness is patient, and its call is growing louder. But for now, I will listen carefully and obey, because ignoring the bells is no longer an option. It is a danger I cannot afford to take. The sanctuary wasn't just a place built from bricks and mortar. It was a monument to secrets, shadows, and whispered histories that stretched back centuries. I never knew its full story when I first walked through those iron gates, but as the nights passed, curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me deeper into the darkness beyond the surface. On a cold, restless evening, with rain drumming steadily against the sanctuary's cracked windows, I found myself in the small library tucked away on the upper floor. Dusty tomes and yellowed manuscripts lined the shelves, their spines cracked and faded. The air smelled of old paper and forgotten memories, thick with the weight of untold stories. I pulled a worn leather-bound journal from the shelf, the caretaker's personal records I later learned, and settled into a rickety chair beneath a flickering lamp. The pages were filled with faded handwriting, recounting events long buried beneath layers of silence. The sanctuary had once been a monastery, founded in the late 1800s by a secretive order dedicated to guarding what they called the Veil, a barrier between this world and something far darker. The journal described how the monks had sealed away forces they barely understood, using rituals and wards that blurred the lines between faith and fear. But something had gone terribly wrong. The order had vanished almost overnight, leaving the sanctuary abandoned and cursed. Over the years it passed from one caretaker to another, each encountering the same chilling phenomena: whispers in the walls, shadows that moved on their own, and the relentless ringing of bells that didn't belong to any church. As I read, I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. The sanctuary was no mere building. It was a battleground, a place where the veil between worlds was thin and fragile, and where the darkness was never truly gone. The journal warned that the rules I was following were not just practical advice. They were desperate attempts by those before me to survive the same terrors I now faced. Sitting there, surrounded by the silent testimonies of the past, I understood the sanctuary's true nature. It was alive with secrets, with pain, with something ancient and unforgiving lurking just beyond the veil, and I was trapped in its story now. As I turned the brittle pages of the caretaker's journal, the weight of the sanctuary's history pressed down on me like a suffocating fog. The words detailed rituals that blurred the boundaries between this world and the next, ancient ceremonies meant to bind something dark and restless beneath the earth. The monks had feared what lurked beyond the veil, yet their attempts to contain it seemed to only deepen the curse. That night, after reading for hours, I felt the sanctuary around me shift. The atmosphere grew heavier, charged with a presence that seemed to echo from the past. The air chilled, and distant, unplaceable whispers drifted through the corridors, voices of those long gone or trapped between worlds. I decided to revisit the chapel, a place described repeatedly in the journal as the heart of the sanctuary's power and mystery. As I stepped inside, the air thickened. The faint scent of incense and something far more bitter clung to the cold stone walls. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows that seemed to watch me, their movements unnatural and disjointed. Suddenly, a low hum filled the room, growing louder, resonating through the very stones beneath my feet. It was a vibration, subtle but relentless, like the heartbeat of the sanctuary itself. The journal's warnings echoed in my mind. The monks had believed the chapel was the thin spot where the veil was weakest. I felt a pull toward the altar, a force both magnetic and terrifying, as I ached. The shadows thickened, swirling around me like living smoke. The flickering candles sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness heavier than night. In that moment, I sensed a presence, a cold, watching entity, ancient and patient. It didn't speak, but the weight of its gaze pressed on my soul. Fear rooted me in place, but also curiosity, a desperate need to understand what had been sealed away. The sanctuary's past wasn't just history. It was a living nightmare reaching out through time, and I was caught in the middle, the latest keeper of its haunted secrets. As the hum faded and the candles reignited, I staggered back, breath ragged, heart racing. The journal slipped from my hands, pages fluttering open to a final chilling entry. Beware the veil. It is thinner than you know, and the darkness waits. The hours after that night stretched endlessly, heavy with a silence that screamed louder than any noise. I sat alone in the dimly lit library, the caretaker's journal lying open but forgotten on the table before me. My hands trembled slightly as I traced the faded ink on the pages, each word now soaked in a new, terrifying meaning. The presence I'd felt in the chapel wasn't just a memory or a trick of the mind. It was real. Ancient and patient, it seemed to watch from the shadows, waiting for any sign of weakness. The veil, once an abstract concept in a dusty book, had become a living, breathing boundary I could feel pressing against my very soul. That night, my sense of time fractured. Minutes felt like hours, and every creak and whisper in the sanctuary's walls tightened the noose of dread around my chest. I replayed the low hum in the chapel over and over, the sensation of cold smoke swirling at my feet, the oppressive darkness that swallowed the candlelight. I realized how fragile my grasp on reality had become, how the sanctuary was slowly eroding the barrier between my mind and the abyss. The journal's warnings weren't just history, they were a map a guide to survival in a place where past and present life and death were dangerously intertwined. The knowledge was a double-edged sword. With each revelation, the sanctuary's grip seemed to tighten. I felt both cursed and chosen, trapped in a story that stretched far beyond my own life. The monks who had come before me were voices in the dark, their despair echoing through time. Yet, amid the fear, a strange resolve took root. Understanding the sanctuary's origins gave me a sliver of control. Knowing what had happened, what might happen, was the first step in fighting back, in holding on to my sanity. But the sanctuary's darkness was patient. It waited behind the veil, watching, always waiting. And so, I sit here now, writing this confession in the quiet hours before dawn, hoping these words will outlive me, hoping that someone someday will learn from my story, will heed the warnings etched in blood and shadow. Because the sanctuary's secrets are not just stories, they are warnings, and the veil is thinner than anyone dares to believe. The sanctuary's walls weren't just silent witnesses to the horrors within, they seemed alive, as if the building itself was watching me. Over time, I began to notice subtle signs, almost imperceptible, that I wasn't truly alone. The sanctuary had its silent watchers, invisible yet unmistakably present, and they made the air thick with tension. It started with the eyes. Not real eyes, of course, but shadows and shapes that flickered at the edge of my vision. A dark corner that seemed to shift when I looked directly at it, a fleeting glint from a cracked window pane, the way a peeling wallpaper pattern appeared to contort into watchful faces. I told myself it was just fatigue or my imagination playing tricks, but the feeling only grew stronger. Then came the sounds, the faintest rustle of fabric in empty rooms, the softest footsteps echoing down deserted hallways, and the distant tapping of something sliding or scraping just beyond. Hearing, I could never catch a clear sight of these watchers, only their subtle signs, a presence felt rather than seen. One night, as I made my rounds, the air grew unnaturally cold. My breath fogged in front of me, and the sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. The soft, almost imperceptible tapping started again, slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. It wasn't just a sound, it was a message, a warning encoded in silence. I stopped moving, heart hammering, eyes darting around the shadowed corridor. A sudden shift in the darkness caught my attention, an outline so faint it might have been a trick of the light. Yet I could feel the weight of its gaze, like icy fingers pressing against my spine. The sanctuary's silent watchers were always there, lurking just beyond perception, unseen but undeniable. Their purpose was unclear, but their presence was oppressive, as if they were the keepers of secrets too dark to face. The rules never mentioned them explicitly, but I learned to respect their gaze, to move quietly and carefully, lest I draw their attention in a way that wasn't meant to be. Living under their watch was exhausting. Every shadow became a potential threat, every silence a loaded pause. The sanctuary didn't just trap my body, it ensnared my mind in a web of paranoia and dread. Yet despite the fear, a strange part of me felt tethered to these watchers, as if acknowledging them was part of surviving this place. To deny their existence was to invite chaos. The sanctuary's watchers were silent, unseen, and eternal, and they never blinked. That night, the sanctuary's silent watchers made their presence unmistakably clear. As I moved through the shadowed corridors, the tapping sound grew louder, more urgent, a deliberate rhythm that echoed off the cracked walls. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was an active message, a warning that something was very wrong. The air grew dense, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. My footsteps faltered, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape the suffocating atmosphere. But something deeper held me in place, a cold curiosity that overpowered my fear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a faint outline in the darkness. It was just a blur at first, a distortion in the shadows, but it quickly took shape. The watchers weren't just shadows. They had form, subtle but undeniable, figures cloaked in darkness, their edges flickering and shifting like smoke in a breeze. They didn't move toward me, nor did they flee. Instead, they seemed to observe, their gaze heavy and unwavering. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, like drowning in cold water. My breath caught, and my heart pounded so loud I feared it might betray me. The tapping turned into a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat echoing through the empty hall. It felt like a countdown, a warning that something was coming, something worse than the shadows themselves. I tried to speak, to break the silence, but no sound escaped my lips. The watchers remained still, their presence a silent judgment. I felt exposed, vulnerable under their gaze, as if they could see every hidden fear and secret thought. Time warped in that corridor. Seconds stretched into minutes, each moment filled with a crushing weight of anticipation and dread. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures dissolved into the darkness, leaving me alone with the ringing silence. The sanctuary's watchers were not protectors. They were not ghosts or spirits seeking solace. They were sentinels, guardians of a darker truth, enforcers of the sanctuary's cruel rules. That night, I understood that the Watchers were a part of the sanctuary's very soul, eternal, merciless, and always watching. In the days following that night, the weight of the Silbaros, Ant Watchers pressed down on me like an invisible shroud. Their presence lingered in every corner, in every shadow that flickered just beyond the edge of my vision. I could feel their gaze, cold and unyielding, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone within the sanctuary's walls. Sleep became a fractured, restless ordeal. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw those shifting figures, felt the steady tapping echoing in my ears like a sinister lullaby. The sanctuary's silence transformed into a symphony of unspoken warnings and unseen eyes. Even in waking hours, my skin prickled with a phantom awareness, as though the Watchers were perched just behind me, scrutinizing every move. I found myself second-guessing every step, every decision. Was that creak a floorboard settling or a Watcher shifting closer? Was that faint breath on my neck real, or the sanctuary playing tricks on my mind? Paranoia became my constant companion, tightening its grip with each passing day. Yet despite the fear and exhaustion, a strange bond formed. The Watchers, for all their coldness, became a twisted source of reassurance. Acknowledging their presence, moving with care and respect, felt like a fragile pact, a way to coexist with the darkness rather than be consumed by it. I learned to speak softly, to move quietly, to avoid drawing their attention unnecessarily. The rules had never mentioned the Watchers explicitly, but experience taught me that ignoring them was dangerous. Their silence was not mercy, it was patience, waiting for the moment I slipped, faltered, or broke the fragile thread of order. The sanctuary's walls seemed to breathe with their presence, pulsing with a tension that never fully eased. Every shadow, every whisper, every heartbeat was a reminder that this place was a trap, not just of stone and wood, but of fear and watchfulness. And though I longed for escape, I knew the Watchers would follow me beyond these walls, in dreams or waking life. Their vigil was eternal. I am trapped in their gaze, a prisoner to their silent watch, and I fear that as long as the sanctuary stands, I will never be free. The sanctuary wasn't just haunted by the Watchers or the shadows. There was something else, something unseen but palpably present, lurking beneath the surface of reality. I first felt it on a night when the air hung heavy and thick, as though the atmosphere itself was charged with a restless energy. It was a feeling that clawed at the back of my mind, a presence just beyond sight that refused to reveal itself. I was making my usual rounds through the upper floors, the flickering lights casting long, unnatural shadows that danced on cracked walls. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the old heating system and the soft echo of my footsteps. Yet beneath that quiet, I sensed something watching me, not with eyes, but with a weight, an oppressive force pressing down on my chest. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath turning to mist in the cold air. A faint scent, metallic and sharp, filled the corridor, like rust and something far more unsettling. I paused, heart racing, every nerve on edge, straining to catch a hint of movement, but the hallway remained still, unyielding. I reached for my flashlight, its beam trembling as I swept it across the walls. Nothing, just peeling paint, broken windows, and the sanctuary's decay. But the feeling of being watched intensified, a silent presence that seeped into my skin, cold and invasive. I tried to rationalize it, fatigue, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew this was something different. The sanctuary wasn't just a building filled with memories and echoes. It was a living entity, shaped by the fear, pain, and darkness trapped within its walls. That night, I felt the unseen presence brush against me like a shadow passing through a veil. Intangible, wise, yet undeniable. It wasn't malevolent in the way the Watchers were. It was something older, something patient and waiting. A force that observed silently, waiting for the moment to make itself known. I quickened my pace, eager to escape the suffocating grip of that invisible weight. But even as I moved away, the sensation lingered, an unshakable reminder that in this sanctuary, the most dangerous threats are not always visible. That night, the unseen presence made itself known in the most subtle yet terrifying way. I had been walking the dim corridors, flashlight cutting through the thick shadows, when the atmosphere shifted suddenly. like the sanctuary itself was holding its breath. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing against my eardrums and muffling even the faintest sound. As I rounded a corner near the old chapel, a cold gust swept past me, carrying with it the sharp metallic scent I'd come to dread. The air thickened, and the temperature plummeted to a biting chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I could feel it then, that invisible weight settling on my chest, squeezing, making every breath a struggle. My flashlight flickered erratically, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. The darkness around me deepened, folding in on itself as if something was gathering just beyond the beam's reach. I stood frozen, heart pounding, sweat prickling cold against my skin despite the chill. Then I felt it, a soft brush, like a whisper of cold air, glide past my neck. It wasn't wind. The sanctuary was sealed tight against the outside world. It was something else, something intangible and alien. The presence was close, invading my personal space without a sound or shape. I wanted to run, to flee the oppressive grip of that unseen force, but my feet refused to move. The weight on my chest grew heavier, suffocating. My viscera ion blurred at the edges as panic surged, a wave of pure primal terror crashing over me. In that moment, I realized the unseen presence wasn't interested in manifesting in the ways I expected. No ghastly figure or scream. Instead, it haunted the spaces between senses, a creeping dread that wormed its way into every corner of my mind. After what felt like an eternity, the pressure suddenly lifted. The temperature slowly rose, the metallic scent faded, and the sanctuary's usual silence resumed. I stumbled forward, breath ragged, shaking uncontrollably. I knew then that this presence was not just a part of the sanctuary's history or folklore. It was alive, patient, and watching, waiting for the right moment to fully reveal itself. In the days that followed that terrifying night, the unseen presence settled into the edges of my consciousness like a persistent shadow I couldn't shake. Its invisible weight pressed on me, not just physically but mentally, threading itself through my thoughts and dreams. Every quiet moment was haunted by the memory of that suffocating cold, the metallic scent, and that ghostly brush against my skin. Sleep became a battlefield. I would lie awake, heart pounding in the darkness, senses stretched thin, waiting for the familiar pressure to return. Dreams offered no escape. Instead, they were filled with shifting shadows and the feeling of being watched from just beyond the veil of reality. I awoke more exhausted than before, the line between waking and sleep blurring into a haze of unease. The sanctuary itself seemed to pulse with that presence. Hallways I once walked with routine now felt charged with hidden menace. I found myself flinching at every unexpected sound, the creak of floorboards, the distant drip of water, even the faint rustle of fabric. The presence wasn't loud or overt. It was subtle, insidious, invading every quiet space. I questioned my sanity more than once. Was this real, or just the product of isolation and exhaustion? But the physical sensations, cold spots, sudden chills, the scent that lingered, refused to be dismissed as mere imagination. It was as if the sanctuary breathed around me, alive with this unseen force, patient and watchful. The journal's warnings echoed in my mind. The sanctuary was not just a building but a thin place, a threshold where worlds brushed against each other. The presence was a guardian of that threshold, neither wholly malevolent nor benign, but an ancient force that demanded respect. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, moving cautiously, never lingering in one place too long. The presence was a reminder that I was a trespasser, a fragile human caught in a web far older and darker than I could comprehend. Despite the fear, a strange resolve grew within me. Understanding this presence, acknowledging its existence, gave me a flicker of control. It was the first step in surviving the sanctuary's grasp. But the presence waits. It watches. And I know it's only a matter of time before it decides to reveal itself fully. The sanctuary held secrets deeper than its crumbling walls and faded corridors. Ancient rituals whispered in shadowed corners. Practices long buried beneath layers of dust and time. I hadn't known about them until I found the torn fragment of an old parchment tucked inside the caretaker's journal, its edges brittle and worn, the ink faded but still legible. That evening, the sky outside was a bruised purple, the dying light barely filtering through the sanctuary's stained glass windows. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, mingling with the faint trace of something like burnt herbs. The sanctuary seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting. I sat at the small wooden desk in the study, the torn parchment spread out before me. The script was archaic, but I could make out the outline of a ritual, one meant to bind the veil and seal the darkness. The words were haunting, full of urgency and desperation, and hinted at a forgotten ceremony that the original monks had performed to contain the darkness lurking beneath the sanctuary. The ritual called for precise movements, chants in a language lost to time, and symbols drawn with a hand steady but fearful. It spoke of offerings, things I could barely comprehend, and warnings that failure would invite the darkness to consume everything. As I traced the faded symbols with a trembling finger, I felt a sudden chill wrap around me. The sanctuary's silence deepened, shadows lengthening and darkening like living things. I realized that the ritual was not just history, it was a key, a way to keep the sanctuary safe, or perhaps to unleash something far worse. The idea that I might be expected to perform this ritual weighed heavily on me. The rules I'd been living by were simple survival tactics, but this parchment suggested a deeper responsibility, one that blurred the line between protector and prisoner. That night, I sat with the fragment in my hands, the weight of centuries pressing down on me. The sanctuary's past wasn't just a story to uncover, it was a burden I might have to bear. That night, the weight of the forgotten ritual pressed heavily on my mind as I wandered the sanctuary's dim corridors. The torn parchment burned in my pocket, a fragile link to a past I barely understood but could no longer ignore. The sanctuary seemed to thicken with a suffocating tension, as if the very air was charged with anticipation, waiting for something to happen. As I passed the chapel, a faint whisper echoed, indistinct but filled with urgency. The flickering candlelight cast two rambling shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold gust swept through the hall, carrying with it the faintest scent of burnt herbs, the same scent I had noticed earlier near the study. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, I followed the scent toward the altar. The room was empty except for the faint outline of symbols etched into the stone floor, symbols that matched those on the parchment. The air felt electric, charged with a presence that was both ancient and restless. Suddenly, the candles flickered violently, and a low hum resonated through the sanctuary, vibrating through the stones and into my bones. Shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching and contracting as if alive. My heart pounded in my chest as the whispers grew louder, almost chanting in a language I couldn't understand. I wanted to flee, but my feet remained rooted to the spot. It felt as though the sanctuary itself was compelling me to stay, to witness something forbidden. The parchment in my pocket seemed to burn against my skin, as if urging me to act, to complete the ritual long abandoned. Panic surged, mingling with a desperate hope that this ceremony might be the key to surviving this place, or perhaps the catalyst for something far worse. The sanctuary was no longer just a place to endure, it was demanding a response. In that moment, I realized the rules I'd been following, stay silent, don't enter the basement, beware the bells, were just fragments of a larger, darker puzzle. The ritual was the missing piece, a desperate attempt to hold back a darkness that refused to stay buried. As the hum faded and the candles steadied, I stood trembling, caught between dread and determination. The forgotten ritual was no longer just history, it was my burden now. The moments after that night felt like walking a razor's edge between hope and despair. The sanctuary seemed to exhale a breath it had held for centuries, yet the air remained thick with tension, as if the darkness had merely paused, waiting for the next move. I was left clutching the torn parchment, the fragile link to a ritual that might be my only defense, or my undoing. Sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the humming, the shifting shadows and the scent of burnt herbs that still lingered in my nostrils. Was the sanctuary trying to tell me something, or was it warning me that I was in over my head? The responsibility weighed heavily. I was no monk, no guardian of ancient secrets. I was just the janitor, someone meant to clean and maintain, not confront centuries-old curses. Yet the ritual was now part of my reality. The rules I'd clung to for survival felt incomplete, mere fragments of a much larger, more terrifying whole. The sanctuary wasn't just a place to endure. It demanded engagement, a role I had never anticipated. I found myself torn between fear and reluctant resolve. Could I perform the ritual? Would it even work? The thought of invoking something unknown filled me with dread, but doing nothing felt worse. The sanctuary's silence had begun to roar in my ears, and the watchers in the shadows seemed to expect action. I spent hours poring over the faded script, trying to understand the chants, the symbols, the sequence. Each line felt like a whisper from the past, a desperate plea or warning from those who had come before me. The pages spoke of balance, of binding the veil to keep the darkness contained. Failure, the monks had warned, would unleash chaos beyond imagination. The weight of that knowledge settled deep inside me. I was trapped in a story much older than myself, a story written in blood, shadow, and fear. And now I was its reluctant author. In the quiet moments, I felt the sanctuary's presence grow stronger, waiting, watching, pressing against the fragile barrier between worlds. The forgotten ritual was no longer just a relic, it was a lifeline. But the question lingered, was I ready to take hold of it? The final chapter of the sanctuary's long and tortured history unfolded slowly, like the last hesitant breath of a dying storm. The air hung heavy with anticipation, the shadows deeper, and the silence more profound. I could feel it in every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the failing lights. Something was coming, and the sanctuary itself seemed to brace for it. The night had fallen like a shroud, swallowing the crumbling halls in a blanket of darkness. The windows, long broken and stained, offered no comfort, only fractured glimpses of a sky too dark to be natural. I moved carefully, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the stale air, illuminating the peeling paint and broken remnants of a place caught between time and oblivion. I paused near the main hall, where the sanctuary's ancient bell tower loomed overhead like a sentinel. The bell, silent for decades, suddenly felt like a dormant beast ready to awaken. My heart hammered in my chest as a chill wind swept through the corridor, carrying with it the faintest hint of those mournful bells, bells that were never meant to ring again. I thought back to the rules that had kept me alive, the strict commandments etched in my mind. The sanctuary's warnings weren't just superstition, they were survival. The bells, the watchers, the unseen presence, the forgotten ritual, all threads woven into a fragile tapestry holding back something far worse. I knew the final warning was near. It wasn't a loud alarm or a crashing thunderstorm. It was a quiet, inevitable shift, a moment when the sanctuary's dark heart would reveal itself fully. As I stood there, the shadows seemed to close in, thickening like smoke, and a whisper slipped through the silence. Not words, but a feeling, a cold promise of the reckoning to come. The sanctuary had waited centuries for this moment, and I was standing at the edge, caught between fear and the desperate hope that I could face whatever darkness lay ahead. The final warning wasn't just for me, it was for anyone who dared enter this place, a last chance to turn back before the veil was torn open forever. That night, the sanctuary shifted in ways I had never imagined possible. The air, usually heavy but still, began to pulse with a strange energy, like the very building was breathing, alive and aware. As I made my rounds, the faint tolling of bells drifted through the darkness, each chime more urgent than the last, echoing off the cracked walls and rattling my nerves. I stopped near the bell tower's base, heart pounding as the wind picked up, carrying a chorus of whispers, ghostly voices woven into the night air. The sanctuary seemed to hold its breath, the usual creaks and groans falling silent in anticipation. Every shadow deepened, becoming thicker and more oppressive, like ink spilled across the walls. Then, the ground trembled slightly beneath my feet, a low vibration that spread through the floorboards and up my legs. I gripped my flashlight tighter, its weak beam barely cutting through the thickening darkness. The sensation was unnerving, as if something ancient was stirring from a long sleep, ready to reclaim what had been locked away. Suddenly, the bell above me began to swing, moving without a single touch, its hollow clang ringing out loud and clear. The sound was bone-chilling, a summons from the depths of the sanctuary's soul. The ringing seemed to pull the shadows toward it, drawing them together in a swirling mass of darkness at the foot of the tower. I backed away slowly, heart hammering in my chest, breath ragged as the air grew colder and heavier. The watchers, the silent figures I had glimpsed before, appeared in the periphery, their forms coalescing into clearer shapes. They moved without sound, encircling the bell tower as if guarding it from some unseen force. Then came the unseen presence, the oppress. Weight that had haunted me for so long. It pressed down harder than ever, making each breath a struggle. The sanctuary felt like a cage closing in, the thin veil between worlds tearing at the edges. In that moment, I realized the final warning was not just a message, it was a reckoning. The sanctuary's darkest secrets were no longer content to stay hidden. The rules, the rituals, the watchers, they had all been preparing me for this moment. As the bell tolled again, louder and more insistent, I braced myself for what was coming next. The sanctuary was awakening, and there was no turning back. The echoes of the bell's toll lingered long after the clang had faded into the heavy silence of the sanctuary. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, each inhale a sharp reminder of the weight pressing down on me. Not just the cold air, but something far more intangible and suffocating. The final warning had come, a harbinger of things that even now I could barely comprehend. The sanctuary's walls, once silent and steady, seemed to pulse with an ominous rhythm, as if the building itself was alive, waiting for the inevitable unraveling. Shadows clung thicker now, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, and the air tasted of something metallic and ancient. I felt small and fragile, a mere human caught in the vast machinery of a dark design far beyond my control. In the quiet aftermath, my mind raced with questions and fears. What had I truly awakened? The Watchers, those silent, unblinking sentinels, had appeared again, their dark forms barely perceptible at the edges of my vision. They did not speak, but their presence was a cold, unyielding judgment, a reminder of the sanctuary's relentless hold. I wrestled with the heavy knowledge that I was no longer just a janitor, no longer just a caretaker of dust and decay. I was the keeper of a threshold, a reluctant guardian standing on the edge of a dark abyss. The rules I had lived by, the rituals I had uncovered, all pointed toward an ancient struggle, a fight to keep the veil from tearing completely. Sleep became a stranger as I lay awake, haunted by the bell's mournful toll and the shadows that refused to fade. The sanctuary's silence was never truly empty. It was filled with waiting for the next chapter, the next reckoning. I felt the weight of centuries pressing down on me, the burden of secrets kept and promises broken. The final warning was clear, the darkness was patient, eternal, and hungry, and I was caught. God's in its grasp. Yet amid the fear, a flicker of determination remained. To survive the sanctuary's wrath, I had to understand its rules fully, and perhaps rewrite them. The story was far from over. And as the first light of dawn seeped through the broken windows, I braced myself for whatever came next, knowing that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again.